So breaking bad news is actually, if you look in any family medicine textbook, these days it's pretty much a formal standard part of family medicine training. And it's probably one of the big jobs that we have as a doctor. As a matter of fact, you can say almost every single day we're breaking bad news. So if you're telling a patient they've got hypertension or they've got diabetes, or obviously if they're HIV positive, all of those actually are telling the patient something that is going to change the way they think about themselves. So this is our definition, quite a nice definition for bad news, is it's any news that drastically and negatively alters the patient's view of their future. And almost any illness, even if it's a very severe back pain and they're going to be off work, or if they've got tuberculosis, all of these things are actually something that alters the way they're going to think about their immediate or possibly even their long-term future. So if we want to talk about any topic, we always start off with the physiology. And when we talk about breaking bad news and having these difficult conversations, we have to understand emotion. And I've spoken a little bit about this before, so we're going to just refresh and understand how emotion plays into behavior, and specifically in how that influences how we think about breaking bad news. So just to remind ourselves, each of us has a survival system that's made up of our limbic brain, our endocrinological system, our sort of various neurological and endocrinological pathways. The purpose of it is evolutionary. We share it with the animal kingdom, and its only purpose is to make sure that you stay alive for long enough to be able to have children. It has no other purpose. And it has built into us very specific drives and instincts to try and keep us safe from an evolutionary point of view. So it obviously has the fight, flight, freeze, fawn response. So that is whenever we are under threat, being able to try and keep us safe. But there's also very specific drives. So we have a drive for resources, whether it's food or other things that can keep us safe. We have a need for safety, so you want to make sure that when you go to bed at night, you are somewhere where you're not going to be in danger. We have a drive for intimacy and sex. So it's not necessarily just about procreation. It's also about being in a relationship where one could potentially raise young. We have a drive for tribe. So there's a natural tendency to stick with those that are similar to us. If you think in the animal kingdom, you sort of stick with your herd or your tribe. And there's a drive for power. So the more power you have within a society, the more potential you have to survive. So these are very basic instinctual drives. It's not the only thing that makes us up as human beings, but it's an important part of our daily lives. And the way the survival system works is the way it implements, if one could say, these responses to the world around us is through emotion. So emotion actually has an evolutionary purpose. And there are primal emotions that's been very well described that has very particular neural pathways and neuropeptides that's to do with them. These are emotions we experience even before we think about them. And there's actually not that very many primal emotions. As human beings, we're obviously very complex creatures. So these primal emotions can then cognitively be extended to form extremely complex emotions and gives us all those, hundreds of emotions you see on the emotion wheels. But on a very basic level, there are three main emotions. And I want you to consider this in terms of somebody who you've just told they've got cancer or HIV. So the first drive is that of rage, or the first emotion, which is the biological impulse to destroy an obstacle in your way. And you've all been at the receiving end of that and if you're thinking in terms of patients, or somebody is frustrated or angry about something that's happened, and they criticize and attack you in that moment. Fear is obviously the biological impulse to run away or to avoid. When we're talking about denial, that becomes important. And distress, I've mentioned before, is this biological impulse to cry out. So whenever we feel rejected, alone, when we've experienced a loss, when we feel that we're not managing to do something like we're supposed to do something, so anything that makes us feel excluded in some way creates an experience of intense emotional pain. And that gives us impulse to cry out. So if somebody is actually sobbing and they're upset about something that you've told them, they're actually experiencing quite extreme emotional pain in that moment. Just briefly, some of the positive emotions that's also there, and we're going to use those when we help our patients. So care is the biological impulse to nurture or take care of somebody else. So if we bring that into our consulting rooms, that's that wish and that need to nurture and look after somebody else. Play is the biological impulse to interact. That's all our hobbies and and interactions with people. And then seek, which we all use every day in our consulting rooms, is that biological impulse to explore or to learn or to solve a problem. And these emotions are all positive emotions. They're emotions that create a positive drive within the human being, where these are all negative. As I've mentioned, these emotions will now create more complex patterns as we start to think about what we feel. So secondary emotions, negative emotions. So what's interesting is that when we are in these negative emotions, our body goes into a survival system mode. And what it literally does is it cuts off your prefrontal cortex and your higher, more intelligent parts of your brain, because it's only looking at trying to get you out of a tight spot, literally. And so generally the cognitive extensions of the negative emotions is almost always irrational. So when somebody's very angry or very fearful or very distressed, all kinds of irrational ideas and thoughts might come out. And you've all had that experience of trying to have a conversation with somebody that's very distressed, and you're not able to actually explain something because they're not able to listen to what you're saying. But you can think of emotions like grief, resentment, denial, shame. All of these emotions are very complex emotions with have very ideas that are linked to these. Shame is a good example. It's got complex ideas of how you view yourself and what you think has happened and how you think other people is viewing what's happened. Oh, my spelling there, apology. So jealousy is a nice example of how jealousy can be as a cognitive concept. We all know what jealousy means, but for some people, jealousy might be more rage, wanting to go and destroy that obstacle in your way, or it might be more fear, terrified that somebody's going to leave you, or it might be more distress, feeling abandoned and lost. So you can see that's very complex how these emotions then create these secondary emotions. Our positive emotions are very interesting because when we are not stressed and we're not in survival mode, we're actually able to use our whole cortex and our whole prefrontal cortex. And so the positive emotions are actually much more linked to our rational self. So if you are able to bring down all that stress, you're now able to bring compassionate communication. You're now able to have curiosity or gratitude or qualities like humility and reliability, all becomes possible with these positive emotions when we're not in that stress state. So importantly, the emotions is trying to get you to do something. Remember, they're biological impulses trying to keep you safe. And so the kinds of behaviors we might see these are all behaviors that makes us feel as if we're doing something. So if your patient is becoming very critical or is trying to manipulate you, quite often that is when they start bargaining. They're hoping, well, if we do this, will that sort it out? Or maybe if we, can we treat this? Can we cure this? I saw an old man yesterday with quite advanced dementia, and I was counseling the wife on this. And then she was like, well, is there rehabilitation? Can we rehabilitate him to make him better? So you're starting to look for ways out of that scenario. Sorry, it wasn't a manipulation, but just gives an idea of how we respond to biological impulses. Worrying about things, trying to please other people, feeling very sorry for ourselves, avoiding, so that's an important behavior, in denial, so the patient just never comes back to you again, for example, or distracting ourselves with substances are all behaviors trying to deal with these very powerful, strong emotions. There's also very amazing behaviors that comes about when we're able to access this higher part of ourselves. And all human beings have access to these capabilities. We all have a prefrontal cortex that makes it possible for us to have these qualities. So in family medicine, we talk about what qualities do we think a family physician should have so we can trust them. And they have this something called A-Rich, which includes agency, reliability, humility. So those kinds of qualities are not qualities that you just teach somebody. I'm going to now teach you to have integrity. These are all qualities that actually naturally arise if we are not within this negative emotions. So that just gives us a bit of background, and we're going to draw on this when we talk about breaking bad news. So why is it so hard? There's actually quite a lot of papers written about breaking bad news. And a big thing that is constantly identified is a lack of training. Either our trainings are too it's almost too recipe based, or sometimes it's just not training at all, or there's just not enough of it. So it might be one module that you have during your entire 6 years of medical school. And I think one of the challenges is that we don't really know how to teach in terms of dealing with emotion. As people, it's quite hard dealing with other emotions because it brings up our own emotions. So physicians don't particularly want to get into those kinds of conversations. Some people find a huge personal discomfort with speaking about those kinds of things. We don't want to upset the patient. So we are worried that the patient is going to go into a rage or anger, especially if you'd perhaps given them hope and said, no, it's probably fine. And now the result comes back terrible. And also culturally, it gets tricky. So now you want to communicate information, but you're not entirely sure what is appropriate to actually tell this person and their family. You might have your own cultural challenges. And then just our biggest challenge, I think, especially in a Ward 5 setting, we were talking yesterday, it was like a train station down there. We had an extraordinary number of extremely sick people. So to now have a proper conversation in terms of time, a private space, a place where you can sit down with people and make a plan makes that much more difficult. What we do know is that a properly structured and well-orchestrated communication has a positive actual therapeutic effect for the patients. So they've shown that if we do that conversation really well, patient actually ends up accepting the information much better and they get less traumatized. So you can actually traumatize a patient by the way you give them the news, and there's a way of reducing that trauma. Very important, this is the first step to build trust. If you do that in a way that is dismissive of the patient or where the patient does get traumatized, that's going to affect your relationship with that patient throughout the rest of the treatment. And that's almost uncorrectable. You can't go back once you have hurt a patient, you're not going to be able to go back. It's definitely been shown also that patients are much more likely to adhere to the treatment plan. And we've definitely have had patients who's been so traumatized by what they've been told or the way they've been told that they just don't come back. So if you want people to actually take treatment or engage with what's happening, that's very important. And it's going to set the emotional tone of how things are going to go forward. So we want to get away from, oh, but dear, this is terrible, and there's not much we can do, to this is great that we know this, we're going to make a plan, we're going to work together, we're going to be a team in this. So we want to create an emotional tone of how we're going to tackle this together. So there's quite a lot of talk, and you'll see when you read things about breaking bad news, and I'm going to challenge that a little bit today. It's all about, no, people must be empathic. The problem with the term empathy is it's an extremely vague term with lots of people having different ideas of what empathy means. It's also a very northern term, global north term. And it sort of envisages this like, elderly, warm, fuzzy, general practitioner who's all sweet and kind and nice. But the reality is that all people have different ways in how they able to relate to patients. And actually empathy has got lots of different components. So for example, some people might personality-wise be very what they call gregarious, might be very got high levels what they call agreeableness, might be very socially confident in speaking to people, might be very empathic in the way that they relate to other people, so able to read emotion very well and able to respond to emotion very well. And that's a natural personality trait. It's not necessarily to have those traits to be able to do an amazing consultation with your patient. And the focus needs more to be about how do we do a patient-centered approach. So there's, it's been actually quite controversial in medicine, and should we, like, when we select doctors, should we try and select doctors who are empathic? And then they want to measure it by how well doctors read, for example, emotional cues. So if you take somebody who's neurodivergent and might struggle to read emotional cues and might be struggling if there is actually too much emotion, get overwhelmed by emotion, etc., then one would say, well, actually certain people shouldn't be doctors. And I'm challenging that concept today. So you can be somebody who might be quite socially anxious, who might be quite reserved, who might not be very good at reading all kinds of cues. If you are crafting a patient-centered consultation, you can actually meet the needs for your patient and do an amazing consultation without being a warm, fuzzy person. So the idea with the patient-centered approach is that you accept that the patient is the one that knows what's going on for them, and they're the one that's going to need to decide how to move forward. And you are there just to facilitate a process. You are not here to tell the patient how they feel or how they should feel, to even pick up magically in terms of what's going on for them. You're not there to interpret their lives for them. You are there to serve them. So patient-centered means placing the patient's agenda at the center of that consultation. And there's 3 levels on which we do that. So a cognitive level is a paradigm shift, and where when the patient is sitting in front of you, that you really truly understand that the patient has equal importance and value to yourself. So their culture, their beliefs, their ideas, their lives, you are not a more important person in that room. We are literally there to serve the patient with certain information, but the person in that room that has the most knowledge and understanding about our life is that person. And you're just bringing a very small component of information that's going to be very vital to that patient, but the patient in the end is the one that has to decide what's going to happen. So when we talk about feeling, what kind of emotional state do we want to bring into that room, into a patient-centered, and that's why I talked a little bit about those emotions. You want to make very sure that you are not going into that consultation in any state of rage, fear, or distress. So you've got to be aware of your own stuff. And so we want to be calm, so that we're actually not triggering our survival system. And the two emotions you want to bring to that is, I like this unconditional positive regard. It's to do with that care emotion. It doesn't mean you have to be a very warm person in terms of personality, but it means in that person, all your attention is focused on that patient. You are 100% engaged with this person in front of you, and you see them in a positive way. And then the third one is that seek that I spoke about, that seek emotion, is that curiosity. What is the best way that I can help you in this moment? How are we going to figure out the issues that needs to be figured out? And this is an emotional state we want to actually craft and cultivate as doctors for all our consultations, but it becomes very important in these scenarios. And then on a behavioral level, we actually want to use the rules of compassionate communication, and we're going to give you some tips and tricks on how to do that. So the classic one we all know is spikes. It's not actually the only, it's sort of a systematic way of managing a breaking bad news consultation. I really like something called the breaks. They're actually almost exactly the same. But there's one small difference, and I just realized I never actually do the spikes in the way the spikes happens, and we will go through them. But spikes has this something called invitation. So before you tell the patient what the news is or what the results is, you try and figure out how much they want to know. But I find it's a bit of a catch-22, because we hardly ever in a scenario we're going to tell the patient, do you not or want or not have your results? The practical reality is the patient comes in, they're here for the results. So you're going to tell them the result, and usually you will break whatever the result is. We'll go through that in detail, and then it becomes important to figure out how much detail they want. So I agree the invitation is very important in terms of asking how much the patient wants to need to know and listening in, but I find it happens after you've actually given the information. So I'm going to show you the breaks, but as I say, breaks and spike is pretty much exactly the same. So the B stands for background, or will be setting if you're using spikes. And this is what happens even before you open the conversation with your patient. So ideally, you need to be able to understand what the bad news you are going to break. So if you've looked at a CT scan or an X-ray, or you've got a histology report and it's a cancer or something you know nothing about, you might want to double check in with your surgeons or your oncology team and actually understand a little bit what this means and what the implications is going to be. So it's important that you at least have some understanding of the news that you're going to give the patient, and some understanding also of where my patient is at. Is there somebody with them? Are they here on their own today? Would they have do you think they should actually have somebody with them in that scenario? And very important, and yesterday we had that problem of, is there somewhere a safe, quiet space that does not feel rushed where we can actually have this conversation? So break specifically adds in something that the spikes does not add in. It does have it in there, but not as a separate acronym. And that is for setting up your rapport. And that is very much to do with how you open that conversation. So one of the things is in terms of how we organize our consulting room. So I think most of our rooms has got an open consulting space. And that simply means that you and the patient actually have an open space in front of you rather than a desk between you. And that in that moment you are able to, and then that you're on the same level as the patient. So rather than being in a huge chair and the patient sitting down there. And very important when you open the conversation to be clear what the conversation is about in terms of, today we're going to make a plan in terms of what's going to be best for you, or what's going to be best in this scenario. We're going to, we're going to figure out now what's going on or whatever. So you want to create a rapport that you want to show that you are in that calm, warm, curious space. Interested in my patient, interested in how we're going to figure all this out. So explore, very, very important. This is where you're exploring the perceptions of your patient. And it's quite often when you see a patient, you're giving them the result, but you were not even the one that originally did the tests. And so it's easy to say, I didn't see you last time. I just want to check in. What do you actually know about the illness? And what do they know about the tests that's been happening? And what do they think the tests are going to be? And how are they going to feel about either the positive or even the negative result? So we need to spend a little bit of time here to start getting an understanding of what's going on. And usually the patient has thought about this extensively. And it's very worthwhile to spend time here to understand that a little bit better. We now get to the announcing. We're going to announce it's knowledge and spikes. And all of the guidelines always recommend this, what they call a warning shot. So something like, I'm afraid the results are not what we hoped for. You can have a standard line that you are used to using. So the patient knows a little bit, okay, something's coming. And then being very clear and precise when you actually give that result. The first result that you give, you have to make sure that you don't now start explaining in detail. You give a short, this is what the result is and this is what it means. And this is the point now, and this is going to be, the announcer is going to work together with how we deal with the emotion. Before you're going to share any more information, this is when you're going to start checking out, do you want us to go through this in quite a lot of detail? Shall I just highlight some of the important things? So whatever you're going to do, you're going to give very small chunks of information and then always check in where your patient is. So your announced knowledge bit is going to take place while you're also managing with emotion. And it depends on your patient how much we're working with the knowledge bit and how much we're working with the emotion. And we're going to go through that in a bit of detail. So the kindling or emotion stands for the ability to give space for the emotion. When you give somebody bad news, if you were, say you had a needle stick injury and now you come back a month later and they do your HIV test and your HIV test is positive. As soon as you get told your HIV test is positive, for the next at least 30 seconds to a minute, your brain blanks out and you're not listening to a word I'm saying. Because your mind is going through all the implications of what that means. So you're already thinking in terms of your partner, you're already thinking in terms of having to go on treatment, you're already thinking about who you may or may not tell. So for people, as soon as you hear something, it's drastically altering your life. And they've actually even shown that you go into a slightly hypersuggestive state, meaning that you do actually hear what we say, but it's like hypnosis. It goes really deep. So the first thing usually is just shut up and give the patient time to digest, give them a bit of time. You can usually see the eyes are slightly blanked over. And sometimes you'll feel it's a bit weird to stay quiet, but the patient doesn't seem to be noticing that you're quiet. That means that they are still processing. But also if you have to say something, then you want to give a very clear positive connection to this. We can now make plans about this. It's good that we have this news. We're going to make a plan today. So it's just some positive if you want to give any suggestions under that state. The emotion that the patient brings up, we're going to go through that in a little bit of detail and how we use it. There's something called the NURSE acronym that can help us with that. And then very important, once we've dealt with all the knowledge and emotion, you need to have a very, very clear plan. So all the steps needs to be laid out for the patient. And I would even write them down because by the time the patient gets home, now they can't remember what the plan is anymore because they're still digesting what they've been told. You need to make sure there's clear safety netting. So what do we do when things go wrong while this is all happening? Very important, we need to check what their support is going to be when they go home. Who are they going to tell? Who's around? Who's at home? How are they actually going to get home? And these days with online, we should be able to actually have available links to important bits of information where people can go and get information. The UK has got something called patient.co.uk that's got patient leaflets on everything and well written and well thought through. I'm always nervous about doing that if I don't know what's in the leaflets because it's very British based, but I've sort of got certain things that I know I can refer them to that site. So let's just look just at this dealing with emotions. So there's certain scenarios that might come out. The one is denial. So the patient goes into a fear state. or anger. So especially if the patient was, sometimes you can have a very inexplicable reaction, and the patient might even criticize you or might get defensive and say, but listen, the other doctors didn't say it. Why are you saying this now? Or sometimes you might just have somebody that gets very distressed. And distress might be somebody actually crying, but might also be somebody shutting down, not actually, and then they're in this state of emotional pain. The most important thing to realize when anybody's in strong emotion is that the survival system is an override, and all you are dealing with is the irrational self. Trying to explain anything during this state is a complete waste of time and is counterproductive. You can't cognitively try and overrule and discuss and now work with all these irrational ideas. So things that are definitely counterproductive is explaining or preaching to the patient, trying now to talk over. And the doctors, we're very tempted to do this. We're very tempted to go into very long explanations when somebody's emotional, or trying to minimize the emotion. No, it's not so bad, and don't worry, and I'm sure it'll be fine. Don't make promises you can't keep. Or just avoiding the emotion completely, writing the notes and then trying to move on to another topic. It's helpful to realize that these behaviors are all responses from our own emotions. So it's usually our own discomfort in that moment that's making us engage in one of these behaviors. So just that as an observation or reflection is actually very helpful. So what might work? So step number one, and I'm keeping coming back to this calm, warm curiosity that I've spoken about. And with warm here, I mean attention on the patient in front of you. But your superpower when you are in this calm state, and the thing you need to do for anybody in a strong emotion, no matter what the scenario, is actually compassion. The reason why compassion is important is because it helps the patient to feel safe in that moment, and that helps the survival system to calm down. So there's actually this little acronym. This is from the family medicine textbook. It's called NURSE. And this is just a little, if you're not somebody who's very good with naturally reading emotions, and you can see the patient's upset, but you don't even know exactly what's going on for this patient. You want to try and figure out what the emotion is and the reason for the emotion. And you can either say, I can see you're very upset where you're not expecting this, or you can ask the patient outright, you don't seem okay. What's happening for you at the moment? Gosh, what did you think, or why is it such a... So you want to start exploring a little bit, understanding the emotion and the reason for that emotion. And then it's very helpful to be respectful. I can see this is very upsetting to you. This is not something you've been expecting, and being able to affirm the emotion that's there, that's that reflect. Very important here is to look at what kind of support. So if there is family around, is there somebody you want us to call? Is there some, would you like to have a few minutes to go and actually, and then we talk. And then if the patient stays very emotional, continue with this exploration, try and figure out what's going on in their heads. So sometimes they're having a whole narrative of stuff going on there, and you need to be able to explore that and figure out what's driving that emotion. So all you're actually trying is trying to provide support while the patient is doing the processing. You don't have to process the emotion for them, but you need to provide the space for that processing to happen. After the emotion is settled, so very important, do not give advice, do not plan, do not give any input while they're upset. Once they are calmed down, usually what they will do is they'll calm a little bit down, and then they'll start asking questions. And now you can start engaging, but again, small chunks of information, no more than 2 or 3 ideas in a chunk. And active listening works very well here. So ask them what they think, and then after they've told you and explained what they understand, reflect back to them and what you've heard. And very important, that detailed plan. So in summary on breaking bad news, just place the patient at the center of the consultation, and you're already 90% of the time there, and understanding your role as a doctor. You are there to give and interpret information and often support. You don't have any other job apart from serving your patient in that moment. And there are the references that I've used for this particular talk. Okay, I don't know if we want to take questions. Let's not take questions on this, and then I'm going to move on to the other presentation because